Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present the Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome to the Formed Book Club. Vivian Dudro, Joseph Pearce, myself, Father Fessio. We continue to discuss the Drama of Atheism Humanism by Father Henri de Lubac, whose cause for canonization has been brought in by the bishops of France. I'm going to turn this over to Joseph, who's leading this discussion. I want to make a couple of preliminary remarks, one of my own. First, as we talked about previously, this book was written in the early 40s during World War II. And I can see now as I begin rereading it that it wasn't really written as a book from beginning to end. He was writing articles on the same theme or a similar theme, which he then gathered together. And I think that normally I don't like books that are just collections of essays or collection of articles. But in this case, my analogy is the statue of David at the Accademia in Florence, where you have one statue, but you have to walk around it and see it from different angles, and you can't see it from different angles at once. So you have to kind of do a kreisendes Denken, as Balthasar's encircling thought. And so I think he does that very well. The second remark is that, and I may have mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again if I have, I had the great blessing years ago to be up in a little chalet in Switzerland with de Lubac and von Balthasar. And de Lubac had just come back from a trip to Crete, and he was describing it to us all. And as he was describing it, I thought, I'm learning more about Crete than I've went there myself, because he knows what to look for and what proportions to describe it in. And I find that here. I haven't read much of Nietzsche, certainly not all of Nietzsche. I've read some of Kierkegaard, but not all of Kierkegaard. But he's able to make these citations, which really kind of give you the central thought, the central idea of these thinkers, and show how they are what has led to our present circumstances, with the removal of God, the attempt to have humanism without God. So that's my preliminary remark. I turn it over to you, Joseph.
Do you want to say anything, Vivian, before? Okay. In that case, all I would say is obviously we have a wonderful guide, as Father has just said, in Henri de Lubac here. And I can assure Father Fessio and to anybody who's watching that I have read less Nietzsche than he has and less Kierkegaard than he has. So I do feel as I've been the one nominated to lead this discussion. It's the blind leading those who can see. But nonetheless, if nothing else, it's going to make for an amusing journey. And as we're going to be looking at Feuerbach and Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, we need something to make us laugh. So if I'm the object of amusement, that's fine. So on page 58, which is where we're reconvening, so we got as far through this chapter, we did the first three parts of the chapter. The final part is part 4, the dissolution of man. So I'm just going to comment on things I have highlighted and invite you to interrupt at any time you like, basically. So on that page, we have a quote from Dietrich Heinrich Keller. Even if it could be proved by mathematics that God exists, I do not want him to exist because he would set limits to my greatness. So I think what we have here, and this sort of sets the scene for Nietzsche, is that it's not about truth anymore. It's about self-empowerment. It's about power. And so we're not anymore seeing the love of wisdom, philosophy as something which seeks for that which is true. It's that really we're going to seek for that which gives us the power we desire. And of course, once you have that, and I've said it many times, Jane Austen, the connection between pride and prejudice, once you begin with presumption of pride, you're going to look at everything through eyes which are prejudiced. So at this point, I don't see how any of these philosophers are going to show us anything of objective value. There are lots of psychological insights into them, certainly, but the extent to which they're showing us the cosmos as it is I think, arguable. So we have immediately after that, Martin Heidegger. Basically, he precluded any possibility of even discussing the question of God's existence. So it's not even to be talked about. It's off the table. It's cancelled, if you like. So in the footnote here, page 59, Heidegger implies somewhere that there is no philosophical problem of God, or, to keep to the author's terms, no philosophical decision touching a possible existence in view of God. In other words, that the whole question is not worth asking, and in fact is beyond the parameters of the discussion. And again, where's this coming from? Page 59. That they see their descent from Prometheus, right, the one who rebelled against the gods, whom they acclaimed was the first of the martyrs. So the proto-martyr of pride is Prometheus. So we see where these people are coming from. I don't want to carry on rambling. I've got other things I've highlighted, so I don't know if I should pause for Father or Vivian to say something.
Well, I would say this. I'm thinking about this. We're reading it. We're discussing it. Vivian and I are more American than you are, Joseph, in the sense we've been here longer as citizens. And the European influence here in Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, and then Heidegger, they want to have a theory for why we don't need to talk about God and justify it. We just don't do it. I mean, we just leave God out of the picture without having a theory. But I do think that their thought had an important influence on our practice, over time. We'll see that as we develop here.
Yeah, I agree that there's all sorts of practical, very real ramifications for the pride that they're preaching. But nonetheless, from the perspective of its engagement with anything which can be considered objectively real, I think it's questionable for the reasons reasons I've just said, the reasons they've just said. That's the point.
And again, to repeat what I said at the last session, this did come into American thinking very heavily through the Transcendentalists, through Emerson, Harvard University, or maybe it was still Harvard College at the time. I mean, German Romanticism and German idealism was all the rage in America too. And
German historical Wissenschaft, historicism came in too.
And so even though maybe your average American doesn't realize where could trace American intellectual history, nevertheless, we've been greatly influenced by this thinking through the intellectual history of our own country.
Yep. Yeah, and you'd know much more about that than I would. I know of the Transcendentals and Emerson and people like that, but I've read very little. The one thing he does say, this is actually de Lubac's voice on page 60, towards the middle of the page there. He talks about a vast accumulation of work, most of it distorted by a mass of prejudices, supplied them with a whole arsenal. So basically, you have a great deal of work by people who are geniuses, right? These are geniuses intoxicated by pride, and with the work they do, which is distorted by a mass of prejudices. So, they're not seeing things as they are, they're seeing things as they want to see them. But nonetheless, this applies a whole arsenal of weapons, weapons of mass destruction. I think of, again, Chesterton's The Man Who Was Thursday, where the premise of that book is that bad philosophy kills far more people than serial killers. That bad philosophy can kill millions, not dozens. And page 61 here, we see where it leads, right? If it is just about power, then Karl Marx takes it one step further, refusing to crouch any longer in the speculative concept. Why even talk about these abstract ideas anyway? Let's get down to business. Let's get down to practicalities. He declared that the driving force of history is not criticism, but revolution. Let's basically take to the streets and start killing people as a way of empowerment.
And, there was a little bit of a precedent of this kind of, let's just talk practical politics in Machiavelli. Let's get rid of all this sitting around and talking about abstractions. Let's just figure out how to get power, how to keep it. And so, in a way, Machiavelli was sort of the first man of practical politics. Marx.
A large part of Shakespeare's plays are an engagement with the evils of Machiavelli. I mean,
Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, this is an ongoing.
It's an
part
ongoing
of
thing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, what else do I have here? So, so Nietzsche then attacks, very quickly that all other philosophers that have used this is top of page 62. All philosophers that have actually used the goal of reason, the goal of truth, are now basically dismissed as ruminants of the higher education, the common journeyman of philosophy, or as Wagner put it, the hired porters of philosophy, called the search for truth. So basically, all of philosophy, all other philosophers, are dismissed because they're in the quest for something objectively real and not something subjectively empowering. So Nietzsche says,
and we'll see going
yeah,
forward here, Nietzsche's criticism of reason and of Socrates and of the whole Apollonian side of Greek philosophy.
agreed, exactly. He gets on to Socrates in a moment. But if we can just go back to 62 again, Nietzsche rejects the last bondage.
Where are you, Joseph? Where are you?
62.
62. Where on 62?
The bottom of the footnote part of the page.
Okay.
So the top half of the page. Nietzsche wants to reject this last bondage, which is the world of truth. We have abolished the world of truth. Nothing is true. And then he goes further than that. I mean, this is all logical once you're going to once you reduction ad absurdum, right? Is the very idea of truth any more than a shadow of the dead God? If we start talking about truth, we're starting about God again. We can't have that. So perhaps, indeed, he says, perhaps falsehood is a divine thing. Perhaps there is value, significance, and purpose in the lie, the artificial introduction of a meaning. So basically, artificially constructing meaning, in other words, telling a lie, somehow is going to get us closer to what we want. We can't use the word truth, but what we want than anything else. I mean, to me, it's no surprise that Nietzsche goes mad, because his ideas.
Falsehood is a divine thing in the sense that if there's no God and you say Homo Deus, as the Harari fellow has titled his book for the World Economic Forum, then man is God. And of course, whatever we do is our truth.
Right.
So
Yeah, we are
falsehood,
divine. Yeah.
We're the measure.
Humanizing of divinity. Yep. And as you say, Father, I can't see where it is here, but about let's again. This is an image that recurs in The Man Who Was Thursday. I see Chesterton obviously knows much more Nietzsche than he lets on. The top of page 64, the philosopher is, quote, a terrible explosive from which nothing is safe. And there's images in The Man Who Was Thursday about this philosopher, nihilistic philosopher, who's his head's going to explode, and the best image for us is dynamite, not incense. And then he works a prophet here. He's actually prophesying the consequences of his ideas. Again, still page 64. I herald the coming of a tragic era. We must be prepared for a long succession of demolitions, devastations, and upheavals. There will be wars such as the world has never yet seen. Europe will soon be enveloped in darkness. We shall watch the rising of a black tide. Thanks to me, he wrote, a catastrophe is at hand, a catastrophe whose name I know, whose name I shall not tell. Then all the earth will writhe in convulsions. So, ironically, the madman's prophecies about his own teaching proved to be all too true in the following century.
And de Lubac is writing this. De Lubac is writing this in the midst of World War II.
Yeah, after the Russian Revolution, after the rise of the Nazis, after the rise of Mussolini. So it's all becoming horribly true. And again, he sums up the top of page 65 that, in a word, it will be the coming of nihilism, right? The annihilation is the consequence. And then Nicholas Berdyaev at the bottom of page 65 there, as de Lubac says, he's rightly described this, the death of God is rightly called the self-destruction of humanism, We are proving by experience that, quote, where there is no God, there is no man either. The victory of pride is its own self-destruction.
This having learned from this book the link between Nietzsche and Wagner, I recently was at my daughter's, and she has a whole book just on Wagner, and I was looking up the sections that deal with Nietzsche. It now gives a whole new understanding about what Wagner is doing. The twilight of the gods,
yeah,
the death of God. That this theme now is coming up in the music, and this where there's no God, there's no man either. And so somehow, even this new man who's going to emerge is still going to be a tragedy, and this reveling in the tragedy. They're seeing where it's going before it happens. They're ushering it in, and they're sort of reveling in the destruction of it all. It's kind of an amazing phenomenon if you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, one would be tempted to suggest demonic possession, quite frankly. So
before you go on, Joe, just a typographical note, so to speak. Page 64, 65. On those 2 pages, half of the text is footnotes, and probably more because it's smaller type. But the beautiful thing about de Lubac in this book is that you can read the text above the line there, and you can appreciate it and so on. But if you want to go deeper, he's got footnotes with lots of quotes there. It's really it's a phenomenal kind of teaching device or way of learning more about something.
Yeah, absolutely. For the most part, I think I've quoted one part from a footnote so far, but for the most part, I've avoided it just because I'm aware that we need to expedite the process.
Yeah, that's right. And in a certain sense, the footnotes don't add anything different, but they just develop or give evidence for what he's saying. So he's not just opining things about these people. He is quoting them, and he knows what they've said, and he's analyzing it. So it's a beautiful sample of how an intellect works. Listen to the other, appreciate what's good there, criticize if necessary, but don't just feel about it.
Yeah, and actually, to prove your point there, so to speak, page 70, he gives us...
I'm on page 67. I got something there.
Yeah, sure. So let me just say this because it just follows on from your footnote. Then we'll backtrack to 67, okay? But on page 70, the footnote, he does actually. It's a perfect example. He's talking about Nietzsche. He's not talking about Dostoevsky, but in relation to the top of the page there, at the goal of his dreams of complete emancipation, he does not perceive the impending menace of slavery. In other words, complete self-empowerment actually leads to slavery. A tragic misconception. But then he quotes from Dostoevsky, and as we know that later in the book he's gonna talk about Dostoevsky. But we get a literary insight coming into this philosophy here, with a philosophical insight from the literature. Starting from unlimited freedom, I ended in unlimited despotism, says the revolutionary theoretician Shigalev in The Possessed by Dostoevsky. How many facts prove the deductions of this manic correct, says de Lubac. Back to 67, Father.
All right, middle of the page, and this is de Lubac kind of, I'll call it a subtotal. It's a summary prior to a larger summary. But he says, for man, God, this is the conclusion of this experiment of humanism without God. For man, God is not only a norm that is imposed upon him, and by guiding him, lifts him up again. God is the absolute upon which he rests, the magnet, capital M, that draws him, the beyond, capital B, that calls him, the eternal, capital E, that provides him with the only atmosphere in which he can breathe, and in some sort, that third dimension in which man finds his depth. I just love the way he's able to kind of summarize in a beautiful way what we conclude from the experiment of Nietzsche and Feuerbach.
And I would say there, Father, actually, that especially bearing in mind this is a translation, it's beautiful prose. It's obviously beautiful reason, but it's beautifully expressed.
Yeah, he's not that difficult to translate because he's kind of like St. John in his gospel, not like St. Paul in his letters, that there's or like Tolkien, in those his Anglo-Saxon one-syllable words, he's able to say profound things with, relatively simple concepts or ideas, Onwards.
Yeah, well, I have nothing else. Well, I've already said what I want to say on page 70, so I'm on a bit. So please feel free. I have nothing else till the final page of the chapter, page 72. Just
Okay, well, I had underlined what you had quoted from 70 there, but also, again, this is de Lubac with his limpidness and lucidness about, 2/3 down, spirit, reason, liberty, truth, brotherhood, justice. I pause here. These are not empirical material things. These are spiritual, intellectual things. These great things, without which there is no true humanity, which ancient paganism had half perceived and Christianity had instituted, quickly became unreal when no longer seen as a radiation from God, when faith in the living God no longer provides their vital substance. So this, we take for granted the patrimony of Christianity and even the best of paganism. So this idea of let's get rid of God and turn towards man. Okay, you're going to get rid of everything which radiates from God, everything which God supports. And what are you going to be left with? Yeah, nihilism. That is to say nothing.
Nothing, yeah. You're left with the nothing that's left.
On the next page, he says, top of the page, without God, even truth is an idol. Even justice is an idol. We make up our own truth, our own justice. Yeah.
Yeah. Which actually, ironically, de Lubac is sort of paradoxically agreeing with Nietzsche, because that's basically what Nietzsche's saying, is if we won't have God, we can't have truth, because truth is merely just an idol if there is no God. I mean, so Nietzsche understands it. Well, I mean, I don't see a need to. I've highlighted the whole of the final paragraph of the chapter, but I don't particularly see the need to read it. I think we've.
I think one of us should read that. Do you want to read it, or I'll read it? You can read it.
Yeah, a different voice, Father. I'm speaking too much already, so either you or Vivian should read it.
I've been doing it for the last year and a half. So, but anyway. Nicholas Berdyaev has spoken of a, quote, end of the Renaissance, unquote, and of return to a kind of Middle Ages for our era. De Lubac asked the question, a new Middle Ages? Now, here, it doesn't refer to the High Middle Ages, but to what happens after the fall of Rome, the early Middle Ages.
What's called the Dark Ages. And for a reason, because everything's collapsing. Okay, go on.
For two elements were mingled in the Middle Ages of history, barbarism and the church, which endeavored to educate the barbarians by converting them to belief in God. And I will point out that in the year 1200, which is before the High Middle Ages, there were 40,000 Benedictine monasteries in Europe. 40,000, not monks, Benedictine monasteries. And the population was less than the U.S. is now. So that'd be like having 1,000 monasteries per state in the U.S., okay? And what were they doing? Praying, of course, serving God, but educating, preserving manuscripts. So anyway, there's two elements were mingled in the Middle Ages of history, barbarism and the church, which endeavored to educate the barbarians by converting them to belief in God. Shall we revert to so what will new Middle Ages be? Shall we revert to barbarism? A barbarism no doubt very different from the old one, but surely much more horrible, a centralized, technically efficient, inhuman barbarism, aka World Economic Forum, for example. I keep bringing them up, but it's a good example.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you.
Or shall we, in conditions themselves very different, with deeper knowledge and lifted up by a freer or magnificent impetus, succeed in rediscovering the God which the same church still sets before us, the living God who made us in his own image. That, above all the problems that press for our attention, is the great question today. It was in 1943, it's in 2023, and it'll be here for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We're seeing it we're seeing what he's talking about playing itself out 80 years on. Well,
So
chapter 2, I must confess.
what a beautiful chapter. How much we've learned by just reading that chapter, and how illuminating it is on our present moment. Go ahead, Joseph.
I agree. Well, I was going to say, but by contrast, then I've got far less on Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. I find them relentlessly dark. I can't think about Hilaire Belloc's famous lines from his poem. There's nothing worth the way of winning but laughter and the love of friends. I couldn't imagine Kierkegaard or Nietzsche ever writing those lines, which is probably doing Kierkegaard a great injustice. But I have got passages highlighted, but fewer. So I'm going to tell you why I have my first highlighted. Is page 84. So if you have anything before that, now's the time to speak up.
Well, just to preface it a little bit, what I was hinting at previously, the hero Siegfried in Wagner. So what happens to these men, no sooner do they debunk faith and religion and myth, now they're searching for one again. And what they resurrect is actually the pagan myths. And this is what this chapter is going to delve into quite a bit, is now the search for a myth to replace the ones that they've destroyed. And what de Lubac says in anticipating this, on page let's see. I'm sorry, I'm taking time here.
While you're looking for that,
well, yeah,
I'll just say, the first.
Oh, here I found it.
Go ahead.
I found it. Okay, so on beginning on page 67 at the bottom, if man takes, so first he starts out, we're going to get rid of the gods, we're going to make ourselves God. Then it's, but wait, we kind of still need myth for some reason. So then we end up with the old gods again. So here's de Lubac pointing to this. If man takes himself as God, he can for a time cherish the illusion that he is raised and freed himself, meaning raised and freed himself from the God he once believed in. But it is a fleeting exaltation. In reality, he is merely a base God, and it is not long before he finds that in doing so, he has abased himself. Soon, the old forces of fate, exercised by Christianity, begin to weigh him down again. And what is the end of the mythological heroes they put before us? Like, Siegfried was fated to die, like Achilles. So now we're back to the wheel. We're back to being pressed down by fate. We're back to ending in death. It's just and
the irony, Vivian, is that we see this because we can't create ex nihilo. Whenever we want to reject something, we leapfrog over it back to something earlier. So so neoclassicism was leapfrogging over the Gothic and Christianity, and then Romanticism was leapfrogging over the Enlightenment and rediscovering the Gothic, and you have Gothic revival. So same thing here. We have to get rid of God. So what do? We leapfrog over the whole Christian thing and rediscover a rather warped, perverse. Because again, as C.S. Lewis says, I think I'll get to this later on, but the C.S. Lewis says that that the old paganism was like the virgin awaiting the coming of the bridegroom. The new paganism is the divorcee who walks away from the marriage. So the difference between the spirit of those authentic pagan, Homer, for instance, and Nietzsche, is the abyss that separates heaven and hell, quite frankly.
So you were skipping forward, but I do want to mention some brief things at the beginning of this chapter. The first section is called The Birth of Tragedy, which, of course, is a reference to Nietzsche's book of that same title. And he says on page 74, new paragraph, Die Geburt der Tragödie, The Birth of Tragedy, is a work of genius. So he recognizes that Nietzsche is a genius, all right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Next paragraph. The principal theme of the book is well known. Well, it used to be well known among some, I suppose. The Nietzschean opposition of Apollonianism and Dionysianism. between Apollo and Dionysus, the god of reason and moderation and beauty and aesthetic harmony, with the god of orgy and emotions and passions and so on. And again, this is another rejection of Catholicism in the sense that the Catholic Church is not either or. It's not Apollo or Dionysus, It's reason and emotion. It's scripture and tradition. It's faith and word.
And there's a history of this even predating the church, because as de Lubac says on page 75, Greek tragedy, that marvelous apex of art, is the offspring of this union. In other words, this apparent dichotomy is somehow in Greek, the art of Greek tragedy, brought to some sort of fruitful relationship.
Yeah, I mean, Greek tragedy is actually in conversation with Greek philosophy. I mean, there is an element of faith and reason, or art and reason going on here. So, for Father and Vivian, we're at half an hour. Do we want to stop here? So I don't have much, but I do have some.
we hit. Well, I wonder, can we make it to the end of this section 1? It ends on we're on page 75. It ends on page 82.
Well, I can give that a go. That's fine. I don't have anything to 84 anyway, so I'm done. So you carry on.
All right. Well, he just says what you just said, Vivian, the bottom of page 75 there. The serene hierarchy of the Olympian gods, that's the Apollonian side, sprang from the frightening family of the Titanic gods and luminous Apollonism. In its turn, emerges from the subterranean kingdom of dark Dionysus, so that one arises from the other, but it doesn't replace the other. And then he asked the question on bottom page 76, is such an ideal, that is to say, an aesthetic conception of reality. As
a tragic ideal, by the way. The ideal is a tragic ideal. Right. And now de Lubac is asking, is such an ideal contrary to Christianity?
Right. And of course, the beauty is the way Christianity transforms it, overcomes it. Yes, there is a tragedy called the cross, but it ends in the resurrection.
Right.
Page 78, bottom of the paragraph there, his way of looking at things was not primarily anti-Christian. At that time, it was anti-Socratic. I mean, the idea of reason. Nietzsche himself, a couple lines down, in a letter to his friend Edwin Rode, called his book his anti-Socrates.
So you can see how, if you're going to reject this beautiful synthesis that God has brought about, we're always talking about these contradictory things and these paradoxical things, and how can we bring it all together? Turns out we can't, but God can in Christ, the God who dies and rises. But if you're going to reject that, then guess what's going to happen? You're going to get thrown back into the old struggle between these opposing things, and you're going to try to work it out for yourself what the answer to the struggle is. But it can't be Jesus. A priori, you've removed him.
You're going to work it out for yourself by actually precluding any possibility of the answer.
Yes.
Page 79, about 8 lines down, summarizing here, Greek civilization went under because Socrates vanquished Dionysus. That's Nietzsche's idea. Next paragraph, what had Nietzsche against Socrates? 2 lines down, or 1 line. It was not, as he said later, his morality. A few lines below that. The grudge Nietzsche bore Socrates was rather a kind of rationalism. And we're going to have to see this distinction between reason and rationalism, because what is Nietzsche resisting? What will Kierkegaard resist? A rarefied Hegelianism, a thinking everything out as if we could do it all with our minds, and that the rest of our life was insignificant.
Well, don't you love this line from de Lubac on 80? There is no more disastrous illusion than this victory over illusion, celebrated as a step forward.
So the bottom of page.
And again, what is Nietzsche reacting against? He wants the life of the spirit. He wants mystery. He wants tragic heroes. He wants myth. He wants all these things. It's just that he is rejecting the church who is offering it to him because he wants it on his own terms.
Absolutely. 81 at the bottom. But the struggle between Dionysius and Socrates is not finished. Tragic thought, which seemed to be dead, will come to its own again. And then on quoting Nietzsche, I think on page 82, but 3 quarters down. Yes, my friends, join with me in belief in the Dionysian life and the rebirth of tragedy. The age of Socratic man is over. That's the whole Nietzschean program.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward, Joseph, to next week's discussion because the section is called Myth and Mystery. And the initial expression of myth here is pretty negative. I want to compare that with Tolkien and Socrates, Lewis's view of myth. But we'll do that. Go ahead.
Just look at this quote from Nietzsche himself at the end of that long extract on page 82. Dare to be tragic men, for then you will be saved. But the tragedy of the cross is what he doesn't want.
Yeah.
So he's going to have to find some other tragedy to die on, some other hill to die on. And it's going to be
what exactly is this tragic man going to be saved from?
Right. Good question.
Okay. One question before we finish. Did we want? But obviously we read up to the end of this chapter, which is page 111. Do we want to read on chapter 3, the spiritual battle? Do we think we'll get into that next time?
Probably not, but let's always read a chapter ahead if we can, just in case we run out of,
Actually, that next chapter is fairly short, actually.
It is short, yes.
Yeah, the one
so let's read it. So let's read chapter 3 as well. It takes us up to page 129, and we'll see how far we get.
Very good. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Vivian. God bless you all. See you next week.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumbookclub.ignatius.com.